Reading this material, that is reading Kings at home, because I'm not going to read everything, and we're going to move quickly, assuming that you've read it. And that if you haven't read it, then you're going to miss out. You have to go back and read it later and see what we were talking about. So we're in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 8 through 10 at the beginning there, and you may remember that what has happened here is that the Syrians have surrounded the house of Elisha, and why have they done it? Well, first of all, every time the Syrian king decided to make a raid on Israel, somehow or other the king of Israel knew where he was going. Well, we know how that is. It's the prophet Elisha. And the truth is that you can't outmaneuver God. And this king finds that out, pretty quickly. So his response to that is to send troops, because somebody he said, "Who's the traitor in our midst?" And they said, "There's no traitor. Elisha, the prophet, is telling him where you're going before you go." And so he surrounded the house of Elisha. And Elisha's servant is terrified. You can see that. But as we notice here, Elisha, in contrast, understands he's under divine protection. And so he asks the Lord to open the eyes of the servant, and the servant sees a massive angelic army that is also surrounding them. And so the fear is gone. Now, significantly, after God opens the eyes of the servants so that he can see the angelic army or the angelic warriors, then Elisha prays to God and asks that the whole Syrian army be blinded. And they are. And then Elisha comes out to them, and he tells them, This is not who you're seeking. Let me take you to the one you're seeking. Which, of course, ultimately, that'd be the king of Israel, because they want to defeat Israel. So he basically leads all these blind troops to the city of Samaria and marches them right in. And then God opens their eyes, and they realize we're in the enemy city. We're in Samaria. And, of course, the king of Israel, who lives at Samaria, wants to know, should I kill them? Can I kill them? And basically, Elisha says, that's not what you do to captives. He said, feed them. They're your captives. And they feed them, and those fellows go home. And really, for the near-term future, they don't attack anymore. So an interesting, powerful miracle that goes on there. Unfortunately, they are eventually besieged in Samaria. And when they are, you notice what happens. Food becomes so scarce that even a donkey's head, which, by the way, under the Mosaic law was unclean. You're not even supposed to eat a donkey to begin with. But a donkey's head became high-value food. And along with that, dove droppings also became high-value food. They paid a lot of money to get either one of those, to get any kind of sustenance. And in addition to that, mothers then were driven to slaughtering their own children and eating them. Not a pretty sight, not something that we probably want to dwell on. But if you study the warnings that God gave about violating the covenant, if you look at Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, the passages that I've given you, you'll note that that's exactly what God said was going to happen. That when you violate the covenant, you're going to reach a point. I'm going to let people come in on you, and they're going to deal with you, and it's going to be so bad that these kind of things are going to happen? Well, the king, of course, blames, guess who? I mean, who do you blame for all your troubles if you're not very religious? Well, you blame God. That's the easy answer. You blame God for it. And that's what he does. And his response then to blaming God was, then let's kill Elisha. Kill the messenger. You can't kill God, but kill the messenger. And so he sends a messenger to Elisha, perhaps to kill him himself, but then the king immediately follows. And maybe he's going to kill him. I'm not going to give you an absolute there on that. And when he comes, Elisha's already been told by God what's getting ready to happen. He has them shut the door and keep the messenger from carrying out his duty. And then when the king comes, what does he say to the king? He says, by this time tomorrow, food's going to be cheap. Well, you can just about imagine that the soldier, the text says, who leaned on the hand of the king. And I'll remind you that the imagery, we saw that with Naaman. And the idea is that's a euphemism. In other words, it's a simple way of describing this is the soldier who's provided whatever the king wanted. He's his right-hand man, we'd say. So that soldier is skeptical, to say the very least. And Elisha then turns to him and says, you will see it with your eyes, but you will not get to participate in it. You're not going to get to eat. Well, that's kind of a cryptic description, and we may wonder about it, but it's that the text is going to unfold in just that way. Then, interestingly enough, we turn to 4 lepers. And I do want to slow down long enough to look at the lepers real quick. They're in 2 Kings chapter 7, beginning verse 3. Now there were 4 leprous men at the entrance of the gate, and they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say we will enter the city, the famine is in the city, and we shall die there. If we sit here, we die also. Now therefore come, let us surrender to the army of the Syrians. If they keep us alive, we shall live. If they kill us, we will only die. Well, that's actually pretty good reasoning. There really are 3 alternatives. They lay them all out. They can either die outside of Samaria because they're isolated due to their leprosy. They can try to get into the city, but everybody in the city is about to die anyway. Or they can go to the Syrians and basically throw themselves on the mercy of the enemy army. And they choose to do the latter, of course. And when they do, they come to the camp of the Syrians and they find it abandoned. And the word abandoned is probably not even thorough enough. What has happened is that God has caused the Syrian army, by the way, also called Aram. You've heard of the Arameans? These are the Arameans, the Syrians here. The Syrian army in the night heard the sound of a great chariot force coming up against them. And they ran. They just, and as they ran, they dropped stuff all down the road. Just, you can almost see them. I got to run faster, and they're just throwing off stuff as they rip down the road, and head back for home. So what do the lepers do? Well, the first thing they do is they sit down for a meal. Nobody's had a meal lately, so they eat. I think we probably would respond in much the same way if we were in that situation. And then, having eaten, they begin to haul out the goods, the silver and the gold and whatever else that they want, and they begin to run and pack that away somewhere until finally one of them speaks up. And they all begin to talk about it. Verse 9, then they said to one another, what we are not doing right. This day is a day of good news, and we remain silent. If we wait until morning light, some punishment will come upon us. Now therefore come, let's go and tell the king's household. Now, brethren, don't you think that they capture the reality, the spiritual reality that we're in today? That we have a bountiful feast, a feast of the Word of God, that we know the truth about salvation, it is ours, and we're feasting in a certain sense at the Lord's table. But if we only feast and we keep all the treasures, and there are treasures in the church, the blessings, all the blessings God gives, if we keep those to ourselves, we're not doing something good, are we? We've got as much obligation to realize today's the day of good news. We need to go tell the good news. Spread that news wherever we can. And so, that's what they do. The king is skeptical. I mean, what he comes up with is this. You know what they've done? The Syrian army has left the camp and made it look like it's abandoned. And they've pulled back and they've surrounded it. And when we come in there, they're going to get us. That's what the king thinks. And so finally, the folks around him persuade him, and basically they say, we're going to die if we stay like this. Let somebody go and investigate. And so they do. And what do they discover? Not just the camp abandoned, but they find all that military equipment, thrown off on the side of the road. And word comes back then to the king and all the people in the city. And guess what they do? What would you do if you're starved to death and the shells are all empty? And by the way, it hasn't been long since that was true. Sometimes seemed like. What would you do if you heard, hey, the store on the corner up here has got a big supply of food? What would everybody do if you were starved to death? Well, I expect everybody to head for the gate, out the back doors, and there'd be a line of people going right up Sidewell Road, wouldn't there? And that store probably wouldn't hold everybody. Well, what would happen in the process? Well, what happened here? That soldier that questioned whether this could happen, he saw the plenty, but the crowd, as they pushed out, trampled him to death. He died. So again, Elisha's prophecy came true. Let's go a little bit further. In chapter 8, you're going to discover that the Shunammite woman, we remember her, who Elisha had warned of the impending 7-year famine, now returns, and she asks the king to restore her land. But the servant of Elisha, and we're going to assume it's still Gehazi. Now, he's a leper, so maybe it's not Gehazi, but that's the only servant of Elisha I know. So I'm using Gehazi for that explanation. And he is talking to the king at that very moment when she comes in. And what are they talking about? Well, the king is questioning about all the great things that Elisha has done. And among other things, of course, Gehazi tells about the Shunammite woman and her son that she gave birth to because of Elisha and God, of course. And then the resurrection of the son, which we've all studied that together. And lo and behold, the woman comes in and Gehazi says, look, here she is. And so the king basically says, what is it you need? And she says, I need my land restored to me because I fled because of famine, and somebody took over the land while she's gone. And so the king sends one of his men, and what does he do? Gives her the land back. and says you owe her for all 7 years she's gone. All the produce that came off that land belongs to her. And so that we have that story that is there. Elisha, for the first time, as far as I know, in the biblical record, goes to a foreign city, particularly to a foreign capital. He goes to Damascus in chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. And Ben-Hadad, who is ill, sent Hazael to Elisha to learn if he will live. Hazael went with a present and inquired of Elisha, who said, the king will recover, but he's going to die. Another one of those cryptic, pronouncements that you wonder about until you find Hazael, and he stares at Elisha, and maybe he just dumbfounded. He's going to survive the illness, but he's going to die. And it's then that Elisha bursts into tears. And he wants to know why. And Elisha says, God has caused me to see all that you're going to do to the people of Israel, all the terrible things you're going to do to God's people. How you're going to hurt the children and the mothers with child, and of course Hazael at this point he doesn't think he's capable of all that, and so basically he goes back as denying that that's a possibility. But when he gets back, what does he do? Well, he wets a sheet and takes it into the sleeping Ben-Hadad, and he presses that sheet down over his nose real tight until he chokes to death. He strangles him, in a sense of the word. And thus Hazael becomes the new king of the Syrians at that time. All right, the text now jumps over to Judah. And you got to remember, we're going to go back and forth. We've been doing that all the way through. Jehoram reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. He has a name that's similar to an Israelite king, and that's partly of interest because this is his brother-in-law, because Jehoram married the daughter of Ahab, one of the daughters of Ahab. So you can already anticipate what kind of wicked woman she is. It does not say Jezebel's daughter, which is interesting. He probably had others. And if you followed the whole text, you probably arrive at that same conclusion. According to 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verses 2 through 4, and possibly at the prompting of his wife, Athaliah, Joram, also known as Jehoram, murdered all his rivals, including his 6 brothers. Now, the kingdom was not taken away from Judah because of the promise which the Lord had made to David. Edom and Libnah, though, successfully revolted during this time, so now they don't get the income from there. You can imagine they're going to increase taxes in Israel. In 2 Chronicles 21 reports that Elijah sent him a letter saying the Lord would smite the people, his wives, his children, his possessions with a plague, and he would die of a sickness of the bowels. Now you might say, whoa, wait, Elijah's dead. That's true. The letter was sent before Elijah died. So that's where this comes from. Elijah sent this message. And what happens? Well, according to 2 Chronicles 21, 18 to 20, the Lord struck him with a disease of the bowels, and he died in great pain. And I want you to look at the end of that verse. That verse, every year when Teresa and I read that, I am struck by that verse every time. He died to no one's sorrow. Now, brethren, I don't know about you, but every time I read that, I think, I don't want to die to no one's sorrow. I want to live a life that makes somebody think I'm worthwhile to have around. That's the kind of life I want to live. I don't want to die to no one's sorrow, but he did. And that's what the text reports. Ahaziah ruled only 1 year in Jerusalem. He follows his father on the throne. His mother was Athaliah. Remember, we've already seen her. This is Ahab's daughter, or the granddaughter of Omri. And she and her relatives also served as Ahaziah's top advisors. What kind of advice do you expect them to give? Well, not very good. It's going to be wicked. It's going to be full of sin, and that's exactly what happens. Ahaziah and Joram, the kings of Israel and Judah, fought together against Hazael, the king of Syria. We've already seen Hazael, remember? And what happened? In the battle, Joram or Jehoram, depending on which translation you're reading and what text, actually, because it'll appear more than one way in the same translation. He was wounded in the battle, and Ahaziah went to visit him in Jezreel. Now, why Jezreel? Well, remember, Jezreel is the winter home of the king of Israel at that time. Why? Because Samaria is a little bit higher up, and it's colder. And so you might say the kings of Israel were snowbirds. That's what we call them today, when they leave Michigan and go to Florida to spend the winter. They're called snowbirds. They do the same thing in Arizona, by the way. I've lived there and seen that go on, and you don't want to drive in the city while they're there. Too many of them, and they don't care. They don't have any hurry going on at all. They're not going anywhere. They will cram the roads up. So at any rate, that's what the king is there. So God had instructed Elijah to anoint Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. The former, that is Elisha, he chose personally to do, but the latter missions he left to his protege, that is Elisha. And so a young prophet was sent by Elisha to go and anoint Jehu. But here are his instructions. Put the oil on him, announce him as king, and run like a bandit. Get away as fast as you can. Now, why? Well, there are several possible reasons. The most likely is that his instructions are getting him out of the way before Jehu acts, so it does not look like God is behind some of the wicked acts of Jehu. Now, he does do some things God wants done. We'll talk about that. But he does some terrible things too. And so the prophet follows the instructions, does exactly what he was told. So he arrives, and when he arrives, they're having what looks like a meeting of the commanders. And the prophet asks Jehu if he could have a private conversation with him. And he has that private conversation. And in the conversation, he anoints him like Saul had been anointed and David had been anointed. And then he runs. And when Jehu comes out, all the other commanders say, what did he want? And I'm putting that in my words, but what did he want? And Jehu says, you know him, he's crazy. And they basically say, now look, quit lying to us and tell us what he really wanted. And he said, he has anointed me as king. And they all put their coats down on some stairs, and they get down before him, and they praise him as, long live the king, that kind of thing. Why? Well, I think it's because they don't like the ruler they have. He's done enough damage in just a year that they're ready to be done with him. And Probably that is the reason that they do that. Once Jehu was anointed as the next king, is chapter 9, verse 14, he wasted no time in putting the town of Ramoth Gilead on lockdown. Now, why would you do that? Now, okay, first of all, what do they do now? In Iran, when they were having troubles with people wanting to rebel, they cut off Facebook. Did you know that? They cut it off. Why did they cut it off? They don't want anybody to know what's going on. They don't want the word to spread. They don't want them to be able to get together in some place. And by the way, they end public meetings. You can't, no public meetings. Why? Don't want somebody to assemble a force and come up against them. Guess why he locks down Ramoth Gilead? Same reason. Only they don't have Facebook, and they don't have Twitter, and they don't have cell phones. So if he locks it down and doesn't let anybody out, then they can't go tell anybody. Meanwhile, Jehu gets in his chariot and heads off 44 miles away to go to Jezreel, where we remember the king is recovering. As he is coming along, the watchman sees him, and he's coming with a pretty good army apparently. And the king sends to a messenger and he says, "Go out there and see, is it peace? Is it peace? Do they come in peace? Is everything good?" And the messenger rushes out to them and he says, "Is it peace?" That's what he says to Jehu. And Jehu says, basically, "What have you got to do with peace? Join me." And he does. Well, here comes a second messenger from the king. And the second messenger does the same thing. "Is it peace?" And he says, "What do you got to do with peace?" And he turns around and joins Jehu to fight on his side. Well, finally, the king goes out. And remember, he's got another king with him. Kings of Judah and Israel are together at this moment. And so he goes out and he asks, "Is it peace?" And Jehu says, effectively, "What do you anti-peace people have to do with peace?" Because the reality is, during the entire time that Ahab or any of his family were in charge of Israel, it was full of nothing but trouble and turmoil. They were not peaceful. They'd never brought peace to the land. And Jehu is challenging him, and of course, you know what happens next in reference to that. Jehu, in the midst of this battle that ensues, shoots him through the heart and dumped his body in Naboth's vineyard. Do you remember anything about Naboth's vineyard? Wasn't there a promise made to Ahab that your kin are going to be dumped in that very place, and the dogs are going to lick their blood? Well, guess what? They rinsed out the chariot. All the blood of the king went rolling down into Naboth's vineyard, and guess what the dogs did? They lapped it up. So it's exactly as was foretold. Now, Ahaziah, who is Ahab's son-in-law, remember, ruling in Judah, was shot as well in this battle. He fled to Megiddo and died there. By the way, Megiddo, you've heard of Megiddo. But usually when folks talk about it today, they say Armageddon. Because that's where it is. That's what we're talking about in that place. But he dies there. A lot of significant things happen there historically. Jehu responded to Jezebel's scorn. See, he goes into the city, and there's Jezebel, and she has put on her best makeup. The description makes you think that she must be like a streetwalker that's put on her most gaudy lipstick and gaudy clothing to try to sway the men. And Jehu calls out to her, and she calls out with scorn upon him. And his response to her scorn was to call to the eunuchs. Now remember, eunuchs took care of the king's wives and his concubines. Okay, that because you don't worry about eunuchs having relations with your wife. And I'm trying to be very careful here, but that's why they did it. Okay, so he calls out to them and says, throw her down. And they threw her down, and her blood splattered all over the place. You read the text, you're going to get it. It's there. And then Jehu, with his horse, just trampled all over her body. Now, apparently later, he had second thoughts about that, and he realized she is the queen, or was, and so he sent some people to get her body and bury it. And guess what they found? Not much. Not much. The palms of her hands, and I think her soles of her feet, and her skull. That's it. What happened to the rest of her? Well, do you remember what Elijah said was going to happen to the rest of her? The dogs ate her. That's what happened to her. The dogs ate her. And I want to remind you, in the Old Testament, dogs are not man's best friend. You don't invite them up into bed with you, they'll eat you. Just simply put. So that's exactly what happened. She is eaten by the dogs. Jehu then went to two cities, Samaria and Jezreel. Now, why Samaria and Jezreel? That's the two capital cities of Israel. Samaria is the one in the more mountainous region. Jezreel is in a valley. And so he sends word to those two places, and he says, you pick a fellow to be your king and send him out to fight. And he said that to both cities, and guess what their response is? No, we're good. we're on your side. They already know a little bit about Jehu. They figured him out. And so, no, we're good. You want to rule us? You got it, boy. And he says, okay, that being the case, here's what I want you to do. I want you to kill the 70 sons of the king. And they chop their heads off. And he lays all those heads in a big pile. And he proceeds to tell them, I am guilty of killing the king. But who did all this stuff? And he basically says, we're one people. And so they unite as a nation, oddly enough, around the deaths of a king and his sons. And then Jehu killed all of Ahab's close associates after that. Verse 18, Jehu assembled the worshipers of Baal. Boy, you talk about an interesting thing. He seems to project himself as a worshiper of Baal. He says, everybody worships Baal. Come to the temple of Baal. Come on. Don't let any Jehovah worshipers come. And so they all get on their best worship clothing, whatever that was. It was particularly designed to worship Baal. And they all just cram themselves. You can almost see this house filled, or this meeting house filled like people packing sardines in a can. It's just full. And they say, now, and then Jehu says, now look around. Make sure nobody that worships Jehovah is in here. And they do. They check it out. Nobody's there. And meanwhile, Jehu has posted 80 men outside. And he looks at those men and he says, if anybody escapes, whoever lets him escape is going to die. So what do? When the worshipers come out, they slaughter them. And they bust up the temple and desecrate it, very thoroughly. And that ends Baal worship. Now, sadly, it doesn't end the worship that was started by a man named Jeroboam. That continues. But the worship of Baal, at least for a short time, is brought to an end, but they continue to worship the golden calves. And at this point, the text tells us that Hazael, who is from Syria, remember, begins to afflict Israel, and then Jehu dies. So, what happens in Judah? We go back there, and Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, learned of her son's death, so she sought to destroy all the royal seed. This is the only woman who ever is mentioned as a ruler in the book of Kings over God's people. Only one. And it's interesting how she's mentioned. Because, the normal formula is, this is the son of this one, and he reigned for this many years, and he died. Isn't that the formula? It never says that formula for her. Why? Because God does not wish to have a woman king. That's just putting it simply. He doesn't wish it. We ought to take notice of that, because there's some pretty specific instructions about women in 1 Timothy chapter 2. They are not inferior to men, but they are not allowed to take authority over men in the church. Just bear that in mind. That's God's consistent. You may not like it, but He's consistent, and you got to take that into account. But remember, Athaliah is trying to kill off all the children, right? She misses one. Why? Because Jehoshaphat, who married Jehoiada, according to 2 Chronicles 22, took Joash, one of the sons of Ahaziah, and hid him for 6 years in the house of the Lord. Why in the temple? Why would you hide him there? Because Athaliah is not a full Jew. And so guess what? She can't go in the temple. She's not allowed to. So where are you going to hide the boy? Well, hide him where she can't go. Where do they hide him? Well, it says, in most texts, it says a bedroom. That is not exactly what it is. It is a room where they store beds. That's what it's there for. So they hide him there. And how long does he stay there? Well, the text is going to let us know he stays 6 years in that place with them taking care of him. And who becomes his advisor? Well, thankfully, Jehoiada, the priest, who is a very faithful man. So 2 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, Jehoiada sent for the captains of the king's bodyguard to come to him in the temple, and concluded a covenant with them, making them swear and showing them the king's son, namely to dethrone the tyrant Athaliah and set the king's son upon the throne. Okay, so notice that he makes them form a covenant before he shows them the king. That's pretty smart. Let's make sure all these fellows are on our side before we reveal what we have here. We got the king. We got this young man who's 7 years old, and we're going to make him king, but not unless everybody agrees with us. Now, the chronicler in the book of Chronicles not only gives the names of these captains, but he relates still more minutely that they went about in the land and summoned the Levites and the heads of the families in Israel to Jerusalem, whereupon Jehoiada concluded a covenant with the persons assembled, that'd be everybody else, to ensure their assistance in the execution of the plan. Well, Jehoiada arranged that on the designated Sabbath at the changing of the guard. I love it when I make a mistake that makes me laugh. So in your papers, any of you that have papers, I fixed it on this PowerPoint. But those of you that have papers, it says at the hanging of the guard. No. Not the hanging, the changing. Just add one C, you fix the whole thing. But Gary typing fast, so that's what you end up with. Okay, at the changing of the guard, all would remain on duty and comprise an impenetrable wall of protection around Joash as he was anointed, crowned, and proclaimed. He was to be placed beside the pillar at the eastern gate, which was the usual place from which kings addressed the people. That's according to Holcroft. The plan was carried out, and they clapped their hands and declared, "Long live the king." Well, Athaliah, who really is the treasonous one. Remember, she killed all the sons of the king but one. Who's the real treasonous person? Athaliah. But when she comes in and finds out what's going on, she says, "Treason, treason." But Jehoiada had the troops bring Athaliah out of the temple, take her to the gate, and then execute her there. The people again pledged their loyalty to God. It's interesting to watch Israel because they'll pledge loyalty and they'll immediately fall away. And they'll pledge loyalty and they'll fall away again. It's a lot like the cycle in the book of Judges that you see there. The people then killed Mattan, the priest of Baal. They destroyed the temple and the images of Baal. Jehoash, who is also known as Joash, was 7 years old when he began to reign over Judah. Thus he was 1 year old when he was hidden. We know that just simple math. Joash was a good king, being instructed by Jehoiada, but still allowed the worship of Jehovah in the high places. The temple needed repair in part because the sons of Athaliah had taken the dedicated things to the temple of Baal, and that's according to 2 Chronicles 24. Joash provided special offering receptacle, a chest with a hole bored in it, in the lid, specifically for the building fund. These funds went directly to pay the workers rather than for costly worship accessories. These workers included masons, carpenters, and workers in iron and bronze. Later, however, because there was a surplus, some of the funds were used for temple furnishings. All right, 2 Chronicles 24 tells us Jehoiada died at 130 years old. Why does that matter? Because who kept Joash in the right spot? Jehoiada. And when Jehoiada dies, all of a sudden Joash becomes something different, unfortunately, than what he had been. The ruling remnant of Athaliah's subversions quickly persuaded Joash to restore Baalism, an apostasy that brought God's wrath against Judah. As always, true prophets raised their voices in protest, but to no avail. In fact, Joash responded by murdering Jehoiada's son Zechariah in the temple court. Now here's what I want you to consider. Jesus references a prophet that is killed and his blood's put in the temple. His blood's in the temple. Could this be the man? And I'd say, well, it seems to match up. That's all. And notice the word I used, very careful. Seems. I didn't say it does, but it does seem to match up at that particular place. Hazael put Jerusalem in his sights, but Joash paid him off by raiding the temple and the royal treasuries, though not before the Arameans clobbered a superior force of Judah's troops in battle. Now here's the sad fact. Joash had rebuilt the temple, had refurbished it, put all these things in there, and as soon as he gets in trouble, what does he do? He gives all the stuff that he put in the temple to get this Hazael to go away. Now, why did he not just pray to God? I'm going to propose to you that if Jehoiada had been alive, he probably would have prayed to God, but he's not alive. And so this is the way that it goes down. Joash's senseless and irreverent slaughter of Jehoiada's sons left his servants seething with an anger destined to erupt in violence. They assassinated the corrupt king in the fortress of the Milo. His son Amaziah became the next king. Jehoahaz, Jehu's son, was Israel's next king. He continued to worship the calves, leading to servitude to Hazael of Syria, sorrow and pleading with God for deliverance, and a return to sin. So there's that judges cycle going on again. Pleaded is a word that literally means sought the favor of. It's only used one other time in Kings, and that's where Jeroboam asked the Lord to heal him. God used the kings of Syria to punish his people, but they were guilty of sinning repeatedly, and they too would be punished. So, with afterburners on, we are into chapter 13. Thank you very much.